Hello, and welcome to the Physicians for Social Responsibilities webinar, The Public Health Impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Before I introduce Paul and myself, I want to thank all of the health professionals and climate activists in attendance today who volunteered their time and energy over the past 2 years to compel Congress and the Biden administration into action. It is your unique voices that drive the work of PSR and many of the other organizations on today's call. Speaking of, I would also like to thank PSR's nonprofit partners in attendance for their tireless work, resilience, and dedication to making the largest investment in climate action a reality. The Inflation Reduction Act was truly the result of a large tent movement comprised of countless organizations that embodied the urgency and injustices of the climate crisis. And finally, I would like to thank the Lung Association for providing the excellent speaker, Paul Billings, to participate in this webinar. It is an honor today to introduce Paul Billings. Paul is the National Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the American Lung Association. In this capacity, he oversees the Lung Association's asthma, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, health and air tobacco control advocacy program. During his tenure at the Lung Association, he has led federal advocacy campaigns that resulted in stricter regulations on tobacco products, growth in research funding, improved patient access to preventative services, and cleanup of air pollution from motor vehicles and power plants. Paul Billings has worked for the American Lung Association for more than 25 years. And I am Jake Assael, the policy coordinator with Physicians for Social Responsibility on their environment and health team. I help run their federal policy agenda as far as climate policy is concerned. A lot of people on the call might know me as I spearhead a lot of our action alerts and actions geared towards pushing for stronger regulations from EPA and ambitious climate legislation in Congress. And with that, I will pass it on to Paul.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Paul Billings, and it's my pleasure to share with you some perspectives on the Inflation Reduction Act. I first want to start out by explaining what the law is and is not, and understand that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed under the budget reconciliation procedures of the U.S. Congress. And what budget reconciliation, I know many of you know this, but others do not, is a special approach within Congress which allows the Senate to move legislation with essentially a majority or a 50-vote threshold, rather than being subject to the 60-vote filibuster threshold. So only is a simple majority in the Senate. But the reconciliation bill is limited to provisions that affect taxes and spending, and other provisions that could make programmatic changes or change underlying law would be subject to a point of order and would need 60 votes to be allowed to stay in the bill. So that's why the legislation was narrowly focused on taxes and spending. And I'm going to ask Jake to drop into the chat. The House Budget Committee, it's good to have the House explain what the Senate does, but the House Budget Committee is a really helpful and approachable explanation of the quite complicated provisions of budget reconciliation. But also, because the Senate is evenly divided, this also meant that the Senate had to carefully negotiate to ensure that all 50 Democratic senators or those independents that caucus with the Democrats were prepared to vote in favor, and then have the vice president prepared to break the tie, because it was pretty clear from the very beginning on this legislation that the Republicans were not going to vote in favor of the legislation. The Inflation Reduction Act is a complement to strong federal regulations. It's not a substitute for them. EPA and other federal agencies have a long, critical to-do list of regulations to set or strengthen limits on pollution from power plants, industrial sources, oil and gas industry, cars, trucks, and more. But the Inflation Reduction Act, because of its investments, actually will help make some of these future regs work better by investing in new technology and really priming the pump, if you will, for making the leap to key technologies like zero emission transportation. But one of the things that's important for the American Lung Association, I think important for all public health advocates to recognize, is in addition to implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, the agencies, including EPA, still have a lot of work to do. And so we need to be ramping up our advocacy on the regulatory side as well. One really big provision of the Inflation Reduction Act, which got no attention until after the bill was signed, was a provision that clarified that greenhouse gas pollution are in fact air pollutants. And this should help to inoculate against a potential Supreme Court revisitation of EPA's, the endangerment finding EPA's authority over greenhouse gases, in the case Massachusetts v. EPA. So while they couldn't do key programmatic provisions in the law, the clever senators and staff did get some important provisions included in the law. The Inflation Reduction Act is a big win for climate and public health. There are significant investments in zero emission technology, clean energy, air monitoring, climate justice grants, and more. It is, in fact, the largest climate investment law in U.S. history. Approximately $370 billion will be invested as a result of this legislation. Now, it certainly wasn't a pretty process. It was sausage making, as the old saw goes about Congress, at its worst, I guess, over the last 20 months. It was frustrating. We rode the roller coaster. On several occasions, it appeared that no bill would emerge, or the bill that would emerge would not have any climate investments at all. But as I will discuss, the final bill, while far from ideal, does really make a significant difference in the future of the U.S. approach to climate change. And there are, well, we don't support every provision in the law at the American Lung Association. We are strongly supportive of the overall law because of the benefit it will provide for clean air and climate. I also want to caution everyone, as hard as the last 20 months has been on passing the legislation, that was the easy part. The hard part will be for the federal agencies to actually implement the law, to do the work to design and implement and ensure that those investments are targeted to achieve the maximum benefits for public health and the environment possible. So as hard as it is to imagine, as challenging as the political process was to get that bill to President Biden's desk, the hard work is really just beginning for EPA, the Department of Energy, and the other federal agencies as they work to implement the law. I want to talk a little bit about the provisions of the law. The IRA will not solve the climate crisis, but it will provide significant emission reductions. The analysis that I have seen estimate that it will help cut climate pollution by approximately 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. That's a significant reduction in climate pollution. In addition, an analysis shows that the reduction of the particulate air pollution that will be achieved while we're making these reductions in greenhouse gases will prevent up to 3,900 premature deaths and 100,000 asthma attacks and more than 400,000 lost workdays in 2030. So by cutting combustion of fossil fuels, by investing in zero emission technology, we're going to see significant immediate health benefits as well. How does it get there? Well, it's investments in clean energy tax credits that will help spur the development and deployment of new forms of energy, like cleaner forms of energy like wind and solar. There's a new program that targets methane emissions, which is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. This program will hold polluters accountable by making them pay for methane emissions they release into the atmosphere, and provides more funding for monitoring methane emissions to ensure that we're actually receiving the reductions. I mentioned regs earlier. we are pushing EPA to move forward with stronger regulations to reduce methane pollution from both new and existing sources. And we're expecting EPA to issue a supplemental proposal on that very soon, maybe as early as next week. This methane fee in the IRA is designed to be complementary to EPA's forthcoming regulations. But it's really critical that EPA gets that regulation across the finish line and enacted as soon as possible. There are also tax credits for household appliance purchases, but I want to talk a little bit about transportation electrification and the associated health benefits. There are a number of pots of funding that will lead to the transition to cleaner forms of transportation. There are tax credits for consumers under a certain income to purchase both new and, for the first time, used electric vehicles. There's funding for zero emission medium duty and heavy duty trucks to help rid some of the diesel truck pollution and bus pollution that's harming health, particularly children who are riding on school buses. And while this law won't complete the transition to all vehicles to zero emission, which is a goal of the American Lung Association, earlier this year, the American Lung Association did a report zeroing in on healthy air, and I'm going to ask Jake to drop that into the chat, that showed that a shift to 100% sales of zero emission passenger vehicles by 2035 and 100% medium duty and heavy duty vehicles by 2040, coupled with clean non-combustion renewable electricity, also something that these investments in the IRA will help drive towards, would generate $1.2 trillion in public health benefits from 2020 to 2050. This would involve avoiding up to 110,000 premature deaths and more than 3 million asthma attacks avoided. The IRA will move us closer to this goal of a zero emission future. I'll spend my final few moments talking about environmental and climate justice. One of the things that we learned and what we've known for a while is that the air pollution monitoring network in the United States is woefully out of date and inadequate. In fact, a GAO report in 2020 said the network was in dire need of repairs and updates. There are computers that are running these pollution monitors that are running Windows XP, and the monitoring technology really is 20th century technology. The IRA will complement funding included in earlier legislation, including the infrastructure law and the rescue plan, but it will include funding for multi-pollutant monitoring and fence line monitoring. Too many communities don't know the air they're breathing is unhealthy, and the IRA will help to expand the monitoring in environmental justice communities to understand what is going on so we can drive cleanup. And getting real-time data about air quality is one thing, but throughout the implementation, EPA is going to have to make sure that data gets disseminated to the public in a timely and easy to understand manner. Sometimes communities who are most affected by a particular threat like air pollution are the best voices to determine how to respond to that threat. The Climate Justice Block Grant Program in the IRA gives local communities the power to take steps that will protect the health of their residents. So it's imperative that these grants get funded and are distributed in ways that environmental justice communities can actually access them. You know, Jake, I would also ask you to drop into the chat the document from the National Association of Counties, which sort of goes through a whole bunch of the programs in the IRA, the dollar amounts, and details on how the where it's known the funds will be distributed. So I would refer that to everyone on the call who is interested in learning more about any of the specific programs I've mentioned or some of the programs I didn't have time to mention. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Jake, for the next round of our conversation, and then look forward to the Q&A that will follow.
So as I mentioned at the top of the call, Barb Gottlieb was unable to join us today, so I am stepping in for her. She sends her regrets. And thank you, Paul, for that overview on the details regarding the Inflation Reduction Act's benefits in regard to transportation and all of the other benefits you mentioned. I'd like to personally zero in on the public health benefits that the Inflation Reduction Act will bring through support for a growing trend known as building electrification. Building electrification is a drive to reduce the dependence on methane or so-called natural gas, also known as fracked gas, by replacing our gas-burning appliances, furnaces, boilers, hot water heaters, stoves, with electric-powered alternatives. It's an important piece of the climate solution and one that PSR promotes in cities and states across the nation. We are thrilled that it is now being reinforced by the Inflation Reduction Act. To explain why it's so important, let me say a few words about building electrification and its benefits to health. The goal, as I said, is the transition off methane gas. Methane is a climate superheater more than 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. It is extracted by drilling and it leaks into the atmosphere from the wellhead, processing, transport, and distribution. Given its potency and its high leakage rate, moving off methane is vital to protecting us from climate change. Electrification allows us to do that by replacing gas appliances with highly efficient electric-powered alternatives. Mainly heat pumps to replace furnaces and ACs, and induction stoves to replace gas stoves. That's the climate connection. In addition, there's another issue caused by gas burning appliances, indoor air pollution. Many people don't know that their gas stove or furnace emits dangerous pollutants, including nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. These pollutants damage our respiratory, cardiovascular, and nervous system, lungs, hearts, and brain. For more information on these health hazards, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to one of our fact sheets. PSR focuses particular attention on stoves. That's because they are not vented to the outdoors. When you use your gas stove without turning on the exhaust fan, and who uses their stove fan all the time, the air pollutants remain in your kitchen, where they can produce levels of nitrogen oxide that actually exceed the EPA air quality standards for outdoor air. The negative health effects of gas stoves are greatest on children and on low-income households and people of color. Now, there are ways to protect yourself and your family. There are steps you can take in your own kitchen, and of course, you can advocate for building electrification. So what does the Inflation Reduction Act do to make electrification accessible to more people? First, it includes the high efficiency electric home rebate, which includes $4.5 billion over 10 years in direct rebates for low and moderate income households that install new efficient electric appliances. This makes it more affordable to replace your gas stove with an induction cooktop that heats your cookware without gas and without combustion. For home heating, you can buy a heat pump, which serves as both a heater and an air conditioner. Again, powered by electricity, far more efficient than combustion and much cleaner. A single household can receive up to $14,000 in rebates to switch over to electric appliances. 2, the Inflation Reduction Act offers the Energy Efficiency Home Improvement Tax Credit. This allows households to deduct from their taxes up to 30% of the cost of upgrades to their homes. Taking steps like insulating your home is a great way to reduce the waste of energy, and therefore the demand for dirty fossil fuels like coal and gas. This tax credit also includes installing heat pumps and upgrading your breaker boxes to accommodate the additional electric load. These rebates and tax credits are authorized for the next 10 years, giving you plenty of time to take advantage of them. Third, the Inflation Reduction Act will also leverage the Defense Production Act to bolster U.S. manufacturing of heat pumps. This should provide good jobs as well as ready availability of heat pumps. We strongly recommend heat pumps here in the U.S. We also recommend that the U.S. provide them to Western Europe, which is facing the prospect of a cold winter without Russian gas. Through these measures, the Inflation Reduction Act will help accelerate the transition off of methane and its other provisions. As Paul described, will contribute to clean transportation, renewable energy production, and climate pollution reduction. At the same time, the Inflation Reduction Act also includes provisions that run counter to transitioning off of fossil fuels and prioritizing health. I'll give you 3 quick examples. The first is a tax credit which supports the use of carbon capture and sequestration. Carbon capture and sequestration is a technology that would capture carbon dioxide from power plants in heavy industry and deposit it underground. Of course, if that is to prevent climate change, it has to stay underground forever, a highly questionable claim. Also, most of the captured CO2 would be used for carbon capture use and sequestration, which uses the captured CO2 for so-called enhanced oil recovery. This is where they inject the CO2 in low-producing oil wells to help squeeze out the last drops of oil. This is a false solution to carbon pollution, since it serves to extend our reliance on fossil fuels. Add on top of that, the machinery for carbon capture is energy intensive, and the carbon capture scheme would necessitate the construction of vast networks of pipeline to transport highly compressed liquefied carbon dioxide to utilization sites or storage sites. These pipelines are risky in case of a leak or rupture, since liquefied CO2 is both an asphyxiant and a toxic. The Inflation Reduction Act also allows so-called blue hydrogen to be eligible for the clean hydrogen production tax credit. Blue hydrogen is produced from methane gas, not something we want to encourage. So it is by no means a clean energy option and should not be eligible for a clean energy tax credit. And finally, the so-called permitting side deal. To get Senator Joe Manchin to support the Inflation Reduction Act, Senator Schumer agreed to a side deal that would gut existing permitting laws and allow for the fast tracking of fossil fuel projects. In other words, this side deal would threaten public health, exacerbate climate change, and increase burdens on environmental justice communities. They are attempting to get their deal through Congress by attaching it to a government funding bill that must be passed by September 30th to avoid a government shutdown. PSR strongly opposes attaching the side deal to a funding bill. In fact, I'd like to encourage all of you, as soon as you get off, to contact your members of Congress and urge them to vote against attaching this provision to a government funding bill. PSR has an action alert that I will now drop in the chat. These are not the only critiques of the Inflation Reduction Act. It also includes expanded fossil fuel leasing on federal lands and inadequate investment for climate justice. So we have more work to do. But the Inflation Reduction Act remains the strongest climate policy our nation has ever passed. We want to celebrate that and make sure the law lives up to its promise. That means thinking about how the law is implemented, how it goes from the printed page to the world. I'm going to ask Paul to walk us through the implementation process and suggest how we can engage. So Paul, I imagine a lot of our listeners are unaware of what the implementation process will look like. Can you briefly walk us through that?
Well, I can try. I think that it's going to be a multi-pronged approach, but EPA is getting the biggest chunk of the climate-related funds, and some of these funds will go into existing EPA grant programs, and other places EPA will have to create new programs to let the money. But it should be through competitive grant application process. There should be notices of funding opportunities coming forward from the agency. But also, one of the things the agency has done when it has received new funds in the past is it's gone through some stakeholder engagement on the front end. So there may be opportunities for EPA to either seek out input from stakeholders or to have workshops to share with stakeholders how to access these important funds. So I encourage advocates to make sure that their communities, their states, or organizations within their communities are seeking out those opportunities from EPA to receive these grants. There are other programs that are extensions of existing tax credits, which really are self-implementing, because those programs already exist, like the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for renewable energy like wind and solar. So it's really going to be a hybrid approach, or or multiple different approaches for how these programs will be implemented. But the principal avenue that we're looking at are these various grant programs.
So you touched briefly on how organizations can put pressure on the EPA, but to follow up on that, what can health-focused nonprofits like ALA and PSR do to be sure that implementation is thorough and effective?
Yeah, again, we're talking about nearly $400 billion being invested. So I think it's critical to start to have the conversations with policymakers to engage when there are these opportunities to provide comment, and then also to work to ensure that the communities, and there's a lot of funds that are targeted towards environmental justice, and this aligns with the president's commitment on Justice 40. But how we actually achieve Justice 40, how we actually see these investments, it's important for health groups to work with the organizations that are eligible, and to work with the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis to ensure that they're getting those funds. So it's a combination of, communication and conversation.
Thank you, Paul. And what would you say our members could do in their own states to ensure that their states are taking advantage of federal grants and using them to protect the climate?
But states are a major potential recipient for these funds, and states should be looking for how, and as well as a local government are also potential major recipients. We pasted into the chat that document from the National Association of Counties that show, the different programs where they thought the counties would be eligible. But I think it's important for advocates to contact their state legislators and state officials and encourage them to capitalize on the Inflation Reduction Act funding, and make sure that their states are applying for these funds. And we're also advocating to support these funds. You went through a list of criticism. There's a lot to be critical in this legislation. It was some provisions, were certainly the result of compromise. But we need to be making sure that we are celebrating the success of the investments, making the public aware of the provisions where consumers can directly access funds, either through tax credits or other mechanisms, but also making sure that the policymakers at the state and local level are taking advantage and applying for and getting those funds, and then celebrating where these funds came from. One of the things we're seeing, particularly in so-called red states, is with Republicans taking credit for federal investment, but not identifying where those federal investments came from, things like the infrastructure law or the rescue plan. It's important for the public to understand that the Inflation Reduction Act and these investments in climate are a result of the Inflation Reduction Act.
100%. So as health-focused orgs like ALA and PSR both recognize that environmental threats weigh most heavily on low-income communities of color and frontline communities, which agencies would you say are going to be at the forefront of ensuring that the IRA is executed with environmental justice being prioritized? And how can our organization support the emphasis on environmental justice?
Well, as I mentioned, EPA has got the biggest chunk of these dollars, but DOE and other agencies also have big chunks of dollars. The EPA is about to announce its new office, and I don't think I've got the name quite right, but they're essentially merging the Office of Environmental Justice and the Office of Civil Rights to elevate equity to the same status as, for example, the Office of Air and Radiation or the Office of Water. This is a big step, and it's important for us to make sure that EPA uses that office to fulfill this mandate, and for health advocates to partner with low-income communities, with frontline communities, to help to make sure that we're seeing that commitment to equity and to environmental justice be matched by the programmatic design and execution.
Well said, Paul, and thank you so much for all of your expertise today. Now we are going to transition over to the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I see that we already have a few questions in the chat. So please, if you have questions that come up, please put them in the Q&A function, and hopefully we get to everyone's questions in our remaining time. And thank you for being such an active audience. Appreciate it. To answer Barbara Warren's question first, this recording will be made available to all people that have attended, and I will probably be sharing it on social media as well with our chapters and coalition partners as well. So the recording will be made widely available. Thank you, Barbara. So Daniel Oppenheim asks, it seems to me that most of the tax credits and incentives are on the demand downstream side, while we continue to provide tax credits and other economic incentives to fossil fuel extraction, refining, and distribution supply side. How can we reconcile these two approaches? Paul, do you want to take the first stab on that?
I would say stepwise. I think that what we're seeing in this legislation are significant investments in the demand and downstream, but also we're seeing some upstream investment as well. As I mentioned, the previous conversation, production tax credit and the investment tax credit do support generation, wind and solar generation, but we have a long way to go to curb our commitment as a nation, to curb our dependence, on fossil fuels. We talked about some regulatory approaches to make it less attractive to use fossil fuels and reduce some of the emissions from fossil fuels. But what this legislation really needs to do, and I think it does, is send a clear signal to the market that the future is clean, the future is zero emission. And so, well, we're going to incentivize the demand for clean in this, but also hopefully also spur further innovation and deployment of clean electricity and zero emission technology.
And I would just like to add that I don't think anyone is saying that the Inflation Reduction Act is the end game. This is just a significant first step, resetting the status quo to something more manageable where we can accelerate the transition to clean energy resources. Clearly, fossil fuels still have a foothold, but this bill will significantly cripple that foothold and give more economic incentives to developing renewable resources. So our next question comes from, and hopefully that answers your question, Daniel. Feel free to add some follow-ups if you would like. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee. So please speak a bit more to the health problems and risks that come with parts of this bill as pertains to sacrifice zones. As Jake has pointed out, many environmental justice advocates and coalitions are, one, alarmed about the side deal that effectively weakens regulations and harms communities. Two, have pointed out that the law actually puts several communities at higher risk because of oil and gas permits. And three, are understandably unhappy with the IRA's support for unhealthy and counterproductive so-called carbon capture and sequestration. Paul, I'm happy to take a first stab and you can add some follow-up. So I think, as Paul and I kind of just went over, this is a first step, and by no means is it perfect. But there's a lot of things in here that are going to benefit the same communities that have been disproportionately harmed from the fossil fuel industry for the past. We do need more investments in those communities. We need more investment in air quality monitoring. We need more investment in renewable resources being allocated to communities of color and low-income communities. And we need more investments in home and building electrification, especially in low-income and moderate households, which have more contained spaces and are more disproportionately impacted by gas-burning appliances. So this bill is not perfect, but it makes strides where we need them to make strides. And yes, the provisions that will subsidize carbon capture sequestration are really disturbing. And we do not want to see the extension or continued reliance on fossil fuel resources. But the steps that have been taken give us more of a foothold in making sure that they don't progress any further. The acceleration of renewable energy has now been made more probable due to the Inflation Reduction Act. And the investments made, whether through climate justice block grants or grants for more solar and wind in environmental justice communities, are going to be incredible steps in the right direction. Paul, do you want to follow up on anything?
I just add that the American Lung Association opposes the so-called side deal. We've communicated with the House and Senate our opposition to that, and we have a long-standing policy opposing what we call riders or policy riders on appropriations bills or must-pass legislation like the continuing resolution. And I would just reiterate, yes, there are provisions of this law that we don't like. We do not support carbon capture and sequestration of the Lung Association either. But we believe that the positives in this legislation are very positive, and we should support them and ensure that they're well implemented.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, anonymous attendee. That was a great question. So following up, we have a question from Layla McCurdy. How's it going, Layla? When do you expect the funds to be available for communities and the public? Paul, I'll let you take this one.
I think it's going to take a little while for some of the, particularly where EPA or others are developing new programs for them to get the grants up and running. In other places where the funding is flowing through a proven pathway, they'll flow more quickly. But I haven't really mapped out how fast we're going to see the funds, Layla. It's going to be, it's not going to be tomorrow, but hopefully we'll start to see these funds roll out, maybe early next year for some of them. But government always takes a little longer than we hope. If anybody has any keen insights on when they think a specific pot of money is going to start to flow, please share it in the Q&A. We'll be sure to elevate your perspective.
Yeah, please ask questions. And if there's any follow-up questions that people have already asked that they have based on Paul's and I answers, please drop them into the chat. But until we get a new question, Paul, actually, I have a follow-up question for you, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Yeah, so you touched briefly about next steps for the administration that they can do to follow up on the success of the Inflation Reduction Act, like the particulate matter rule and the methane supplement that's coming through. What are some other regs that you have been eyeing that the EPA or the Biden administration as a whole could take to further their climate ambitions and make sure that polluting facilities are being properly regulated?
Thanks. That's a great question. And let me just reiterate, one of the biggest steps will be this supplemental notice or proposed rulemaking on oil and gas methane that we think could come out in any day. And there'll be a 60-day comment period and a public hearing and a real important opportunity for advocates to engage in supporting, strengthening the cleanup of methane from oil and gas. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the particulate matter, NAAQS, we also expect that soon, maybe as early as next week, could be a little longer. Particulate matter is lethal, and by tightening the standards, it will prompt a whole range of cleanup strategies to reduce exposure to particulate matter. So that's also important. EPA is also working on the ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards. A little further behind, we're hoping that they will propose a strengthening next year, but it's still working through the process at the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. On the motor vehicle side, there's a lot going on. There are new truck rules that are expected by the end of the year. It looks like EPA is just going to finalize the rules on NOx pollution from trucks this year, and is going to issue a supplemental on greenhouse gas emissions to adjust the phase 2 truck greenhouse gas standards. We're expecting that proposal before the end of the year. On power plants, EPA is engaged in a long process to respond to the Supreme Court decision in the West Virginia case relating to the Clean Power Plan, but EPA is working on rules to address carbon pollution from power plants, but also is working on another set of really important rules, mercury and air toxic standards. EPA needs to finalize the appropriate and necessary finding. I think everybody on this call will agree that's appropriate and necessary to address toxics like mercury and acid gases from power plants. And then EPA needs to move forward with rules to further tighten the requirements for these toxics from power plants. This will be a win-win, because by driving down the emissions from power plants, it will prompt some plant operators to determine that they no longer want to invest in those 20th century technology power plants and maybe retire them and replace their generating capacity with the wind and solar that's being incentivized by the Inflation Reduction Act. So important from both a public health perspective as well as more broadly on climate. EPA is also poised to propose new cleaner cars standards next year. And we hope that those standards come out and are finalized so we can address, transportation is the biggest source of climate pollution in the country, and it's vital that EPA propose and finalize strong car standards that will lead to a transition towards zero emission as well. So there's a lot on EPA's plate. They're letting out more than $100 billion in the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then they have this huge regulatory task in front of them. And frankly, we're disappointed at the American Lung Association at the pace of progress at EPA. We need them to step it up. We are almost to October of the second year of this term, so time is running out, and it seems that the rulemakings are taking far too long, and so they've got to get it to the next gear to make sure that we can get these rules across the finish line, because 2023 will be the big year. I've been around a long time, and when you get to presidential election years, things do slow down, and so they've really got 15 months to get a lot of this work done. That's why it's so important for advocates to be banging on EPA's door in every one of these comment periods. And these are key health regulations, to put the health perspective forward, to tell EPA what they need to do to strengthen these rules and urge them to get them done, and make sure that the White House understands as well. One of the big challenges is that all these major rules go to the Office of Management and Budget for this interagency review, and that has proven to be a roadblock, or at least a significant delay for a lot of rules in administrations historically, and we've seen it in the Biden administration as well. So we need to keep the pressure on to finalize rules like the methane rules, like the PM rules, to get these CARS rules out the door and move it forward.
That is why you are the expert, Paul. Thank you for that. So we do have some more questions in the chat. This from Lisa Doggett, who is the president of Texas PSR. Hi, Lisa. Is there any other legislation likely to impact climate change that you are all tracking that we need to have on our radar? I will start by saying that I know the Senate just ratified the Kigali Amendment, which is a huge win for climate, because that will limit the amount of, is it CFCs or HFCs, Paul? I always get confused there.
HFCs.
HFCs, which are usually you find in your refrigerants and air conditioning units, and have climate pollution potential well beyond even methane. So they're highly polluting, and limiting those emissions is going to have an amazing climate victory. And it's about time that the Senate ratified, and I expect the House and the House to follow suit. Paul, is there anything that you're tracking other than that?
I think that the other thing that we're working on at the American Lung Association is the appropriations bills. I think that's really going to be the last train out of the station, if you will, for this Congress, and making sure that there are no bad riders on those bills. We're going to see this continuing resolution is probably going to delay the final bills till December, and then making sure EPA and the other agencies get the funding that they need to implement the work that they have to do. One of the things that we've been working on in those appropriations bills is really looking at wildfires and the impact we're seeing. Wildfires being driven by climate change, the drought and dry conditions are creating horrific air pollution levels in the West. So in addition to the toll that is taking on the people that are living in wildfire communities, people downwind, hundreds or thousands of miles away, are breathing the particle pollution as a result of the wildfires. Then there are some bills that have been moving through the Environment and Public Works Committee to specifically address wildfires. It's hard for me to see them getting across the finish line in this Congress, but we'll see how things align. But as far as the big climate legislation, I think we had the big climate legislation. We had the big win with the Inflation Reduction Act. That is the climate bill, and that will be what will be remembered for this Congress with respect to legislative activity.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for your question, Lisa. Really appreciate it. And this next question comes from my colleague, Zach Williams, who runs our gas stove webinars, highly knowledgeable on building electrification. And if any organization on the call wants to have a gas stoves webinar about the health consequences of gas stoves, please hit up my colleague, Zach Williams. He is the go-to guy on that. So Zach's question, how do the tax rebates for electric appliances work in the IRA? Is it direct discount or point of sale, or do folks have to wait until it is a tax rebate? I'm hoping it's an instant rebate direct discount. I don't think it's the same for every tax provision in this bill, but I think for the home electrification ones in the HERA provisions, which provides low and moderate income households with rebates on heat pumps and electric stoves, those are point of sale. So they would get those, they would get that financial assistance relatively immediately. Paul, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I have not dug into the details on the program, so I can't tell you, but I will say that there are some, and again, referring back to the National Association of Counties, there's some additional details on how the rebate program works in that document in the chat.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for your question, Zach. Michael Martin, hi. I know Michael Martin says, I know some states have put in legislation that prohibits cities within the state from passing legislation that prohibits gas appliances in new constructions. Where are things related to that, and how many states have put that type of prohibitive legislation in place? Paul, you want to take first stab and I can follow up?
Well, I'm aware of the issue, and the American Lung Association is a longstanding policy position of opposing preemption, like the kinds of preemption that you're talking about. But I don't have the definitive list on the states that have enacted that. But I know that we're seeing more attempts to preempt, and it is a concern.
Yeah, and I will add, I also don't have a number of states that have added preemption laws, and also the preemption laws persist in the counties too. So it's beyond state law, but it could also, local entities are also passing these laws as well. But I mean, I think that just goes to show you how important these building electrification, home electrification provisions are. The more financially feasible it is to switch over your electric stove to your gas stove to an electric stove, the more likely the public is going to want to make that switch, especially when the health benefits become more widely known. So this can create more pressure on governments to strike down these preemption laws. So really comes to show you how important the Inflation Reduction Act is to combating these preemption laws. Thank you for your question, Michael. Yes, Barbara, PSR will be sending action alerts out on the EPA regulations as they come out, and other congressional legislation that might demand the attention of PSR's activists and health professionals. Thank you, Barbara. Okay, anonymous attendee. Mentioning Paul's note on upcoming elections and the next 15 months being crucial, what is the risk or likelihood of these EPA rules that we are advocating for being undone or backtracked in upcoming years?
The chance of there being attempts to undo or backtrack rules in the upcoming years, I think, is 100% if there's a change in party in the White House in the future. Well, we saw that with the attempts of the previous administration to undo and change the rulemakings of the administration before that. That seems to be, and we've seen the Biden administration make some progress in undoing some of the harm done by the previous administration. So I think that's something that will continue to be the situation. I'm old enough to remember when the Clean Air Act passed in 1990 with overwhelming bipartisan support. We're a long ways away from that level of bipartisanship and support for these kinds of regulatory approaches. So I think that there's always a chance. Also, the important rules are all going to be subject to litigation. So even if there is not a change in administration, we will see attempts to challenge important rules, be it the methane rules we've talked a lot about, or the ambient air quality standards, or new standards for cars or trucks. So I think one of the things that we're trying to make sure in our comments is that the rules EPA finalizes are robust and are as tight as they can be for litigation. And then the American Lung Association does in key litigation either intervene in support of rules or files amicus briefs in support of key rules. And I think one of the things we need to be really vigilant about is that not only do we have to pass important laws with the Inflation Reduction Act or the Clean Air Act, engage in the regulatory process as the rules to implement those legislation are promulgated or the programs are being funded, but then also engage in a litigation strategy, not only to compel the agencies to enforce or implement the laws, but then also to defend the important rules that are promulgated. So it's a never-ending struggle. And so I think one of the really important for the health voices to be raised. I will tell if you allow me a brief anecdote before the end. In 2000, at the end of the Clinton administration, they promulgated rules to clean up diesel trucks. And it was a rule that came out early in December. It was signed in December, really at the end of the Clinton administration. And when the Bush administration came in, they froze all the rules, and including the truck rule. Advocates, public health advocates, others banded together and told the Bush administration how important cleaning up trucks was. And when they lifted the freeze on the regulations, not only did the Bush administration implement those truck rules, but before long they were claiming credit for those truck rules as their own. So there is a possibility, if advocates band together and tell a good story, that you can see, even if a rule that was promulgated at the end of one administration can survive into a new administration. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that the transition from Clinton to Bush, that was a pretty contentious change of administration, if folks are old enough to remember. Will be what happens in the future. But I think the stronger case we can make, if you look at the progress we've made, we certainly can build and then defend what we build through legislation and regulation.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, we are coming up on time. So I just want to thank you one more time, Paul, for being here and providing your expertise on the Inflation Reduction Act, upcoming regulations, and all of the public health benefits that we are seeing from the IRA, and all that's to come. So really, thank you for your expertise. And I would like to give the last 2 minutes to you if you have any final remarks.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity. I want to encourage everyone to celebrate this win and work to implement it to make it a bigger win. And please, please, please engage in these regulatory fights. We need your voices to ensure that EPA does what needs to be done and gets it done soon. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate the activity in the Q&A and the robust attendance that we received on this webinar. And with that, Julie, you can stop the recording. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day and weekend.